You should all be seeing my Zoom screen. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
I'll inhibit that in a second as soon as we go onto YouTube. You should all be seeing, I'm stopping mine, reducing that. Okay, here comes the music. Well, hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, November 24th, 2018. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today is the first in a series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and the chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to now. Neil?
Thank you very much, Bob. I am delighted to be with all of you today. I am delighted that we are able to start this series, which we have long been preparing for and planning. I would first announce to the viewers that we will be discussing, as Bob stated, the document Revelation Revealed, which is a very long document, more than 200 pages. Particularly, we are going to be discussing topic 8 of Revelation Revealed, which has the title that Bob gave, namely Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. Today, and for the remaining 3 programs of this series, we will really just begin the topic because the topic covers 60 pages in the long document Revelation Revealed. For any of you watching this who do not have the document Revelation Revealed at hand, I recommend very much that you download it and follow along as we are discussing. The document is available from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is spelled as if it were one word, no space, no hyphen, no dot in the middle. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Now, at this point, we will begin the discussion, and it will be streamed to YouTube. YouTube is purely a viewing process. There is no interaction with you as you are watching it in YouTube. If you wish to ask a question, what you should do is to send an email message, email address listed at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor on the internet, namely info@globalendeavor.net. At some point in a future program, the participants will address your questions. We reserve the right to edit them and arrange them as we see fit. And of course, we cannot guarantee that we will use every question. In fact, it is not likely that we will be able to do that. So without further ado, I would like to begin discussion of this interesting topic. But before we really get into the wording on the page, let's talk a little bit about the human context in which we are conducting this broadcast. Today is the 24th of September. Thursday, the 22nd, was the holiday of the United States called Thanksgiving Day. And I think it is fair to commend that holiday as a celebration of giving thanks to God for our blessings. This was the origin of it. It is not actually a holiday established by any religion, but it is established by the laws of the United States to give thanks. Yesterday, however, was a celebration of a very different sort, and I would like to talk about that and get your reactions to it. As you may know, for anyone who lives in the United States, that day, the Friday immediately following Thanksgiving, is called Black Friday. Well, the overtones of the word black in English refer to something that is negative or harmful. And it seems to me that we might start with that thought. Black Friday, as all of you know, I am sure, is a day dedicated to the spirit of buying and selling and wealth. These are not religious values. They are not sponsored by any religion. They are not spiritual. They are not idealistic. To the contrary, they are entirely materialistic. And so, with the materialism of Black Friday in mind, I would like to ask you, my colleagues in this broadcast, whether Black Friday, unlike Good Friday, can be considered to be a pagan holiday. Steve, I think I will call on you first for your reactions to that.
Well, gee, did you know that I just spent $4,000 yesterday on Black Friday?
I would not conclude that you are a pagan because of it.
I can't be a pagan. I'm Jewish. Anyway, yes, I guess materialism is a secular value. I think that there's a healthy gray area in there somewhere where we don't have to go whole hog to be living as an ascetic in a cave, and we don't have to go whole hog and live in a 6,000-foot mansion with 3 swimming pools. So, as in all things, moderation, is a key to a healthy balance of life. So, from what I heard on the news yesterday, we broke all kinds of records on Black Friday in terms of our spending. So the economy is good. People have money to burn, and they're burning it. It's not going to make them any happier. I think they probably already know that. But, I'll leave it at that.
Charles, I'm going to make the question even more complicated before I go ahead and turn to you. There was a terrible illness, pervasive illness in the Middle Ages called the Black Death, which in frequent usage is referred to as the plague. So now, in addition to wondering whether Black Friday can be considered I wonder if Black Friday can be considered a plague.
You want my opinion?
No,
I don't. I think not. Let me. John Locke is the primary philosophical source in the immediate sense to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson quoted him, for the most part, directly and paraphrased him. Locke wrote his most famous works on rights, civil and human rights, political rights, in the late 17th century, and approximately the better part of 100 years later, Jefferson wrote his famous piece. What I'm driving at is this. In the Declaration, if you include all of Locke's language, you would say that God is the source of our rights, including life, liberty, the pursuit of property, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke correctly, I think, put a tremendous emphasis on property. Black Friday, the economic buying spree, is an eventuation of capitalism. Now, I would point out, everything you said, I don't think it's a pagan holiday, but aside from that, I think everything you said is correct. However, there's another viewpoint on having property and expanding your property. It's a basic right. It's essential to a higher standard of living. It exhibits, in this country, a rise, material uplift, and the possible opportunities for that to the average person, what we used to be called a common people, or common man, as the term was once used. So I think Black Friday is a manifestation of the deeper and broader and very important concept of property. We are material beings, after all, and not everything that's purchased amounts to affectations or excessive self-gratification. I think those aspects, those features of it tend to be exaggerated to a certain degree.
Not even
for the average person, it's less expensive. You can save money, and that's significant for the average individual.
So you would even exempt the $4,000 that Steve has confessed he spent yesterday.
Well, billions and billions of dollars was spent. $4,000 wouldn't seem to be an issue.
All right.
Particularly, but I would not, having not known what he spent it on, but knowing Stephen, I presume that he spent wisely. He purchased wisely.
It was all on books. It was on books, $4,000 worth of books.
Okay.
Well, then you did spend wisely, for sure.
Doreen, I would like to turn to you now and perhaps add an additional thought. In my introduction to this question, I spoke of materialism, and really what Charles has said has to do with the normal urges of human beings to accumulate capital. But my concern, frankly, is the ism side, materialism, the consciousness of human beings overwhelmingly dominated by material factors rather than intellectual or spiritual ideals. So how would you go about all of this now, if I could ask?
Well, it's funny when you use the word good, but good is God in many translations. Germanic, I remember, God. So it really depicts something godlike. And so Friday is kind of, I think, a free day, if I'm not mistaken, in translations. So and I'm looking at, so Good Friday is a good day, but that's holy. And that to me is godlike. And now you have Black Friday, which black is black ink, I think, as opposed to red ink is to being in debt. So we can go, the God and godless, or the spirit and the material. And that's how I see it. Contrasts to losses. And I think it's a good thing that they have a day where people have an opportunity to be manipulated and run out like a pack of herds. And they do this all the time anyway. So what's the difference if it's something that benefits them, people will do it. And I don't have a problem. I just don't do that.
Well, thank you. Before I turn to Marvin for his concluding comments on this discussion, I would say that I've heard a different derivation of the day of the week called Friday. The days of the week in English, to my understanding, are based on the names of different gods of the Scandinavian pantheon. So that Wednesday was named after Woden, and Thursday was named after Thor. And I believe that Friday was named after Freya, also a goddess in the Norse or Scandinavian pantheon. But in any case, your comments about the nature of the celebration are interesting. I would now turn to Marvin.
Well, I actually think your question, probably by design, if I sense your intention there, Neil, is pretty related to our topic overall, which is the relation of the true teachings of Jesus. Obviously, true being defined as what comes out of the Urantia book, and because that's what we're all rooted in comparison and contrast to institutionalized Christianity. And so I think of Jesus, for me, it's always been a very evocative image, telling us that we're on a bridge here in this life, and we're passing over to the true land, really. We're here only transiently, temporarily, and he said, lay up your treasures in heaven, where material things won't corrupt it. And I'm reminded of kind of a cute story. I remember hearing about these three accountants who were really good friends, and one of them had just recently passed away, and the other two the next day were meeting over breakfast, and one turned to the other and he said, well, what did he leave behind, and the other one said, everything. So, we really, what we're building here in this life is soul, character, our spiritual selves, our relationship with God. That's the real treasure. That's the pearl of great price that passes all understanding, that is what we're here to really accomplish, is this incredible and intimate relationship with God that we can develop. And the rest of it is props on the stage. And we're going to be leaving the stage. We're on to other stages. And so I think one of the things that institutionalized religion always does in relation to the deeper, more spiritual teachings of the founders of religions is it tends to materialize and trivialize the teachings and tie them to material reality, because that's where many people are grounded. The other thought that I have is I'm thinking of the Protestant ethic as an example of that sociologically. It's sort of a well-documented idea, the idea that material wealth and well-being flows from the favor of God, and if you're holy and pure enough, you'll be rich. And so I think that's a feature of institutional religion, and it really distracts people. It gets them into addictive activities of finding their satisfaction through material accumulation. There's nothing wrong with that, but the real true and deep satisfactions come from loving and being loved and spiritual connection with God and spreading that around. So, that's, and the irony is we've got Thanksgiving, which is a holiday about family relationships and family love, and celebrating a meal of fellowship with people you love and care about. And it's almost like, well, we can only do that so long, and then we've got to go back to the cultural bias of, accumulate, make yourself happy with material goods. And it's really quite a contrast, and I think it's very related to the contrast that you're articulating in our theme.
Thank you, Marvin. I would add just one refinement to a part of your comments. You mentioned the Protestant ethic as implying that God's favor produces wealth. I would say that, yes, you're right, it does. That is one of the implications, but that this idea of God's favor equating to wealth and welfare in general was not original at that time. It had been part of Jewish teachings for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the great dilemmas in the stories of the books that Christians call the Old Testament, that Jewish people tend to call the Torah, is that if God was so much on the side of the Hebrews, why were they doing so badly in the world? Why were they oppressed and so on? So the thesis that God's favor produces wealth is a common view. I'm not going to precipitate a serious discussion of that premise, but I simply wanted to say to you that the Protestants did not invent this. They certainly adopted it. Well, we've had an interesting discussion at the beginning, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten to recognize my vice chairman and chief colleague for the management side of this. Bob, your turn.
Yeah, not a problem, Neil. I'm kind of glad that I went last because I do agree with Marvin that it is what you asked was quite relevant. Doreen, black does mean it's the bottom line of the accounting for companies that are selling products, and it's on the positive side, not the negative red side. So that's how I understood black. Neil, when you ask these curveball type questions, we prepare pretty much from the document. So one of the really great things that the Zoom YouTube does is it actually allows us to have our computers, and we can do searches from Google. It's changed the world. We can search the book for paraphrasing. So I searched the word pagan because you use words very importantly, and I tend to focus on that. And a pagan is a person holding religious beliefs other than those of the main world religions. So taking that into account, I believe that the question goes back to where Marvin was headed. And in fact, it does relate to this idea about we're going to study the Jesus's teachings and some other aspects about religions. So it forced me to go look up the definition of religion. And the third definition is the important one. It says a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. And then the example in the Merriam-Webster dictionary is consumerism is the new religion. So I guess that the question is this materialism, consumerism, is it supplanting or is it aiding and abetting aspects of current main religions, the main world religions? I don't want to answer that here because I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more as we go further. But I just like to put it out there that, in fact, there's probably 4 levels. I think that the Urantia book talks about 3 levels or 3 categories of our religion, from primitive to civilization, evolutionary or real, revealed and true. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that. But thanks for the curveball. It gets the juices flowing here today, and I think that we've got a lot to talk about this full topic here. Thank you, Neil.
Well, thank you, Bob, and indeed, I appreciate your remarks. The word pagan has had many meanings over time. My tendency is to interpret it as a believer in many gods, the pagan gods, pagan deities, rather than one God. But that, I admit, is not the only possible interpretation of the word pagan. And you have highlighted the question of where the values are in terms of the predominant emphasis of life. The Midwear Commission, in the concluding papers of the Urantia book, talk at some length about the extreme danger of materialism and secularism. And my personal view is that Black Friday, in the way it is carried out, is not merely a celebration of commercial benefit, although it is certainly that. I agree with Doreen in this regard. But it is an artifact of a materialistic culture that troubles me, quite frankly. Well, thank you for being patient as we went through this. I thought it would get the juices flowing, and I appreciate you calling it a curveball. I'm not a pitcher. Maybe I can throw a fastball from now.
Or maybe a softball, please.
Softball.
was going to say that.
You rarely do that.
All right. Let's go on to the topic. We are on page 88 of Revelation Revealed, the beginning of the pages concerning topic 8. And I would like to turn to Marvin and ask him to read the 3 paragraphs at the top of the page. It's a primary paragraph and then 2 ticks that give quotations immediately below it.
Okay, were you going to pull that up on the screen or not?
No, we're not. It's going to be on your paper.
Okay, give me just a second here. So,
in effect, and the 2 ticks that follow it.
Okay. Topic 8, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. In effect, we have already examined the true teachings of Jesus, for the term personal religion is essentially a paraphrase that identifies the same ideas. Therefore, we have every right to conclude that the true teachings of Jesus postulate and promote, and then there are two things that they postulate and promote, direct personal experience with God and other spiritual realities, quote, the personal quest for truth, unquote, and, quote, the determination to explore the realities of personal religious experience, unquote, from paper 155, section 5, paragraph 10. And then the second quote, a living love, a life of service. This approach requires continuous bearing of spiritual fruit, yielding the ministry to one's fellows of that which has been received from one's spiritual benefactors. And that's a Melchizedek from paper 100, sections 6 and 2. Do you want me to keep reading?
No, I would like us now to have a chance to comment on these 2 texts, and specifically, I would like to stimulate discussion of how they relate to each other. Are these, in effect, a menu of choices, one or the other, a carte blanche situation? Or are they required as a package? In other words, can one say that one is following the religion of Jesus if one observes only one out of the 2 texts, or are both of them required? Charles, would you like to deal with that?
Sure. I think both are required. However, there's a causality. Personal experience with God is, I think, essential to service, the continuous bearing of spiritual fruit, because it's when you know God as your, let's say, as your Father, as universal Father or universal deity, then your fellow mortals become your kin, K-I-N, and the potential for kindred minds and kindred souls in this context increases. And to have a personal experience with God is to get to know God, the Father, as a father for yourself, so that self-consciousness is shared, begins to be shared with God consciousness, and it's incorporated, it's internalized. And then that the service, essentially, the bearing of spiritual fruit, the yielding the ministry to one's fellows, eventuates from that. I think that's the intent in the Urantia book. That's the intent behind this duality, this concept or duality. So one would follow if you love your fellows, your fellow mortals, the way God loves them, then I think invariably, and presuming it's sincere, you will love your fellow mortals, and then you'll want to serve them, not so much as a duty, but as a labor of love.
Steve, in effect, Charles has spoken of a connection which implies a desire to serve because one knows the nature of God, which indeed certainly involves a service by God to each of us. And therefore, if one knows God, than the desire to pass along these benefit rises spontaneously. Would you agree with that, or how would you connect the linkages between these two elements?
Well, I would try to emphasize that these are really two faces of one element. We don't have a causal relationship here. The first tick does not cause the second tick. The first tick is just a different way of expressing the second tick, and vice versa. You don't have a direct personal experience with God without a life of service, and vice versa. So, I mean, it's good to articulate these aspects, but they're really aspects of a simultaneous, identical experience. They're just articulated in a different way. So I would just emphasize that.
Thank you. I understand your point. I would interject that in the experience of humanity, specifically in the Western world, the first tick would seem to be more traditional in terms of a personal spiritual experience, whereas the second tick, yielding service to others, has not been emphasized as strongly. Bob, would you like to take a look at these two ticks?
Thanks, Neil. When I took a look at these in preparation for here today, I pondered: are these two categories that are the true teachings of Jesus, or do they represent just two salient ones? So, thinking a little bit about what Steve said, is that there's no causality here. I think he's right. Neil, you asked, are these requirements? And no, I don't see these as requirements, because that would then start to get us into doctrine, which is what I think we would try to stay away from. Causation, duty, and worship. Things happen in triads. Seems like a lot in the papers. Thing, meaning, and value, etc. And as I apply causation, duty, and worship to this, the part that's missing might be the part that kind of works with the word true. So again, going back to these parsing of the words to really understand what the revelators are telling us, and to focus a little bit on the words, because that's kind of where, we're pulling apart a very small paragraph here. And so we should look at the words. So I see true. Well, let me put a couple of numeric designations. It's always kind of good to take a look, to do the searches and to find out how often do the revelators, the various revelators, use a term, and then how do I actually connect these dots into various descriptions of the term and put them into some comprehensive concept that I can come up with, that I can understand, and then kind of make it in my own simplistic way. So just to take a second here, the papers use the term true in over 700 paragraphs. So it kind of seems that they want us to develop what this adjective actually means, since they don't provide a definition that I could find. Maybe somebody subsequent to me could come up with a better definition, but I sure couldn't. It's also a fact that the phrase true teachings does not appear in any search of the text. However, the teachings of Jesus does appear 64 times in 35 papers with 7 different authors. So very important. And just to say that I think that the term true in this case is a good adjective in front of teachings of Jesus. It's quite a valid descriptor, I think. And it can include not only the uncompromised or the unadulterated teachings, but true in the cosmic sense of the word. So when I look at the word true and then apply them to the teachings of Jesus, and then to understand that I'm reading the 5th epical revelation, which is, essentially a leavening of the 4th epical revelation. In my definition of true, this word has to relate to cosmic consciousness and spiritual perception. So that means that it's something that's not circumscribed, because neither cosmic consciousness nor spiritual perception can ever be circumscribed. We're going to go through many billions of years until we get to a point where where it's fully open-ended, where it's never circumscribed, because it means, circumscribed is bounded, contained. Well, our spiritual perception will certainly grow and never be contained over time. So I think that the word true in the cosmic sense, at least in this fifth epical revelation, is cosmic in scope and spiritual and objective. For example, and I think we read this in our preparation, in the very last time that we all got together. In the last sentence in the Divine Counselor's summation of true worship, he says, true worship in the last analysis becomes an experience realized on 4 cosmic levels: the intellectual, the merangial, the spiritual, and the personal, the consciousness of mind, soul, and spirit, and the unification in personality. There's a lot going on here with this word true. So I think that that a religion based on the spirit of human experience is where we're headed with this word, with the true teachings of Jesus here. Over.
Thank you, Bob. You have made many interesting comments. I would simply wish to clarify the word requirement that was part of my original question. I was not talking about a requirement in the theological sense, but rather a logical requirement on the part of those who claim to be following the teachings, the true teachings of Jesus, whether that claim would be justified if and only if they embody both of these elements, or if they could be entitled to claim that even if they embodied only one. So that is a logical question in terms of the nature of the two teachings and the ability to claim that one is following them. Doreen, your turn.
Oh, I think you could do both as far as that's concerned. And, you think about life. Well, what is it? There's what the book says, there's no joy without effort. So if it's sincere desire to discover, persevere, to discover the truth, then you have to find a reason. And what is the reason for life? And if you don't discover something within your heart and soul, how do you become happy? What do you find, in the outside world? It's the depth of understanding. I think it increases and develops your personality when you internalize into the insights of the reality of the existence of God. And it's a balance. What happens is the deeper you go, the more God reflects, uses you and opens you up, and you do service. You want to reach out for other people. It's so automatic. You can't contain that impulse of spirit calling. And you start to discover through people and how you reflect through them, and you see yourself. You find that there is an inner knowing. It touches your soul, and you find that you're totally loved and cared for. I mean, that's my experience. I'm talking only from personal. And I found that maybe you're less fearful of life once you have that secure understanding that there is oversight and there's that oversoul and somebody out there loves you, because then it's a calming experience. So you're moved in that way. And I don't know, it's so powerful, the spirit. And you're not so driven, I think, by impulses and habits. And it's a sort of a freedom that comes over you. You're not self-conscious. And it brings, it allows the spirit to dominate your mind. And that's some of the things that I had recognized. There's, this loving kindness. I always responded to people that were kind. And I thought it was so extraordinary, but it has to be not just kindness, but there's something so beautiful about loving kindness, about altruism, somebody who reaches out and does good works. It's so reflective of something deep within them. It's not just a material mind decision. And I learned about these things, not knowing, but I knew there was something so alive in that, so beautiful. And of course, the deeper you search, the more you find. And, I could say that personal religious experience, it develops everything. It depends how deep you want to go and how open and receptive you are to the leading or the controlling of the spirit at this point of my life. So I'm all for it, and thank God. I thank God for opening me up to that when the time was right.
Thank you. I would now turn to the inspiring reader who began our discussion with his mellow voice.
Yes.
And before I yield to him, I will add a little thought, possibly trading a bit on Bob's elaboration concerning true teachings as opposed to traditional tenets and practices. One of the strands of traditional Christianity is certainly in the early centuries was a strand of meditation by separating oneself from the world, becoming reclusive in the form of monasteries, and meditating. Now, to me, I could associate that with a bit of effort with the first of these two ticks, but it would be difficult to associate that internal meditation by separating yourself from the world and other fellows who are not monks with the second tick. So with that additional thought in mind, Marvin, you have a rich collection of observations by your colleagues, and I look forward to how you will wrap this up.
Well, I'll just add a thought. My sense is that these two elements are inextricably interrelated. It's almost like I see it as a circulatory system, and it's a flow of love from deity into us and out of us into others. And my sense is that it's inevitable, that the linkage is inevitable. I think we can do something to artificially stop it, like you mentioned, monastically cloistering ourselves so that we don't have any interaction with people around us, or minimal. But I think that's sort of an extreme situation. What I think of is where the Pharisee asked Jesus, trying to trick him, what are the essentials? What is it that I need to get into heaven? What are the essentials for salvation? And he was, trying to trick him into betraying some of the hundreds of laws of the Orthodox Jewish tradition at the time. And Jesus' answer was he linked those two inextricably. He said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your fellows as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And my experience is that when you do more than just give it verbal credence, the loving God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength. When you really love, you really spend time in worship, and you really spend time loving God with everything you can, to the best you can. My experience is that you don't have to do anything else. It effortlessly flows that you start loving people around you. It's like an overflow. You get filled to the brim, and it's just natural and sort of inevitable. So I don't really see it as something that we have to, like a discipline we have to put ourselves to. I think the discipline is to remember what Jesus said and to really stay in communion with God and love God and experience the inflow of that affection. And I think it changes us. And I think it then inevitably flows out to other people. It's like a circulatory system.
Well, you have the last word, indeed. You had the first and the last. I guess that is alpha and omega in the tradition. But in any case, we're all talking and exchanging ideas, and I welcome the rich diversity of opinion that all of my colleagues today have expressed. Bob, I will now turn to you and ask you to read the introductory wording in the middle of the page, followed by the three short quotations. Please do that for us.
Sure. Nonetheless, the following excerpts provide additional insights that will undoubtedly be helpful. First one, the religion of Jesus is the most dynamic influence ever to activate the human race. Jesus shattered tradition, destroyed dogma, and called mankind to the achievement of its highest ideals in time and eternity. to be perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. This is Melchizedek from paper 99, section 5, paragraph 3. The second one is, the religion of Jesus demands living and spiritual experience. Other religions may consist in traditional beliefs, emotional feelings, philosophic consciousness, and all of that, but the teaching of the Master requires the attainment of actual levels of real spirit progression. And that's remarks attributed to Rodan of Alexandria in paper 160, section 5, paragraph 12. And the third one is, the religion of Jesus fosters the highest type of human civilization in that it creates the highest type of spiritual personality and proclaims the sacredness of that person. In paper 194, section 3, paragraph 7.
Thank you. I would now launch discussion of these 3 paragraphs, which I submit to you are related conceptually, by focusing on a few words that, in fact, characterize the teachings of Jesus as being true, but by contrast, imply that we have not lived up to that in the ensuing 2,000 years. So, for example, in the first quotation that Bob read, it states that the religion of Jesus shattered tradition and destroyed dogma. Well, as we will discuss in this discussion and the discussions that follow in the weeks ahead, the followers of Jesus did not destroy dogma, they created it. They did not shatter tradition, they fostered it by creating traditions of their own. And then in the second one, we have traditional beliefs, emotional feelings, philosophic consciousness. And I would submit to you that the followers who called themselves Christians indeed embodied traditional beliefs, emotional feelings, and philosophic consciousness that they defined in different ways. And then the sacredness of the person who has a high type of spirit personality was not the emphasis that ensued. At least it was not the predominant emphasis that ensued, because the predominant emphasis of organized religion was obedience and conformity, wherein the authority of people at the higher level was superior to the individual consciousness of the personal believer. So here we have, in effect, 3 quotations that are eloquent in describing the true religion of Jesus, but by then examining the contrast with actual practice, we do some part of the path that helps us go to the idea of contrast that is inherent in the overall topic. Steve, have I said something that causes you to react? I rely on you to react in creative ways.
Well, yes, you've pressed my buttons. There's a bit of Monday morning quarterbacking going on here. We have an epical revelation that was given to us by Jesus. And the book talks about how epical revelation inevitably gets filtered down through human consciousness and human society. So that's exactly what happened with the 4th epical revelation, happened with the 3rd epical revelation. It is now happening with the 5th epical revelation. To think that we are not taking the 5th epical revelation and creating our own traditions and our own dogmas based on that is a little bit naive. So that is the fate of all epical revelation, including Jesus' revelation. So yes, that happened, but that's the only way it could have happened. There is no way of taking epical revelation with the purity that Jesus presented in and expect it to survive in human terms in that form. It just is not a possibility. It doesn't happen like that. And we have the example of Abner, for instance, that the book talks about, that took the example of Jesus and was unyielding in applying the teachings to his community, and his community died because he was unrealistic and probably a little bit inhumane in how he applied Jesus' teachings. So he did not respect his society and the limitations of his followers, and that religion did not flourish, and it died. So we have to deal with the fate of all epical revelation and not play Monday morning quarterback so much.
Well, aside from your metaphor of Monday morning quarterback and meshing me in professional football, I think there is an interesting idea here. I'm going to turn to Charles, but before I do that, I would like, Charles, perhaps for you to include comments on the stage of civilization, the stage of human consciousness. Jesus coming as a bestowal son was in an overall context of global ministry that tends to be associated with a far higher stage of human civilization and a far higher stage of human consciousness. If you imagine the context of most bestowal sons in the description that applies to the paper on planetary mortal epochs, it is clear that a bestowal son arriving on a normal world at that stage would be dealing with human beings who had advanced to a much higher level of awareness and knowledge and understanding. So if we then think about that in combination with Steve's point about what works at any given stage and the fate of the epical revelations that have occurred on our planet thus far, would you say that the true teachings of Jesus were in effect in advance of the human consciousness of the people who lived in his era, and whether or not they may be in advance of the human consciousness of the people who live in ours?
Yes to both. I wouldn't draw the inference that Stephen does concerning the fifth epical revelation, simply because, in my opinion, of observing it for over half a century, it's too much of a work in progress in evolutionary terms. But yes, we know that paradise, given a revolutionary stage, which is essentially post-endemic, we were given, the universe was revealed to its source and center, far beyond what is normally revealed at that point. So clearly, in this, the Urantia book is a gigantic step forward for our minds and our souls and our relationships between persons, human or divine. And I think it's always true that revelation is an advance to evolution. Otherwise, how would it advance evolution in the first place? It has to be. All real education is predicated on that, and that's simply a given. The Rancher book, however, is very complex. We're talking about facts, meanings, and values, truths, beauty, things that are beautiful and good. And in other words, we're dealing with science, the scientific mind, the philosophical mind, and the religious mind, as well as history. And we have to somehow integrate that. And in any case, the Rancher book is not a religion, it is a revelation, however, that has religious features to it and contains many spiritual values. The fourth bestowal, any bestowal, as I indicated, would be far more sophisticated and insightful and foresightful than anything previous. It's just simply the relationship, the natural relationship between revelation and evolution. The point that matters, however, is what's the potential to go from actual to potential? In these statements, there are certain words that struck me. I think, by the way, your characterization is quite accurate, Neil, in terms of what is lacking in Christianity. When I make a statement like that, what is lacking in Christianity, it is not intended by me to denigrate Christianity or its wonderful services the last 2,000 years. I could document, as any of us here probably could, many things, many outreaches, both on the individual and collective level that Christianity has fostered. Nevertheless, It treated women, for instance, as to the sacredness of the person. Women were treated as second class in the context of the Christian tradition. And they were ruled out of the ecclesiastical authority. It was a male domain. This is not some incident. This is not some accident. It didn't just, not a happenstance. It reflected prejudices and biases that are very old. It happened in the fourth one, and it's continued for 2,000 years. In recent generations, very recent generations, it has loosened up somewhat. That's just an example. That's very broad, affected large numbers of people, women directly and men indirectly. I was struck most by the phrase, the adjective actual levels of real spirit progression. And I'm impressed by what we call in education performance-related assessments, because they're based, the way you know somebody can write a paragraph is when they write a paragraph. You can talk about all you want about it, but until you actually demonstrate that you by writing a paragraph, you cannot say you have learned it. And I think that applies to all behavior. If you claim to know God, but you don't forgive, it's hard to see how you can know God and not forgive. But now I believe in a certain causality that we were talking about, that I brought up earlier. And the essential distinctions here are the religion of the spirit, in my opinion, in contrast to the religion of earthly authority. And again, I'm not disparaging the religion of earthly authority. However, I am being critical to a certain degree, and I think justifiably so. If you talk about the sacredness of a person, of all persons, then you know what you're talking about, and it's sincere, then you're acknowledging the dignity of personality. From that stems the status of being a child of God and every other mortal. And from that experience, from that position stems the potential for real brotherhood, real actual brotherhood, as a family matter. God and the deity, the Father deity is the head, and we are the siblings in spiritual and religious terms, and socially, in the socialization of religion, and ethically and morally. And what the phrase was used in the book, the temple of spiritual brotherhood, well, that reflects how the universe is designed. But it has to be real. And it is, one way to put that again is performance. And I think the religion of the spirit, the religion of the heavenly spirit, is in contrast in many respects to Christianity generally. And I'm talking about Roman Catholicism, the Greek and Russian Orthodox world, or the Orthodox world in general, and the Protestant world. Very complex. It entails about 2 billion people, or a little less than a third of the human race. And but if you're going to talk about knowing God, knowing Him, not just believing in Him, to know something is much stronger than, much more profound than to believe in. Then it's going to, if it's true, if your claims are really true, your statements of, if someone was to ask you, do you know God? It will manifest itself in actual levels of real spirit progression, inevitably. I happen to believe that with Martin Luther King, that you have to first to get to know God for yourself before you can discern Him in others. So I'm not sure you know what you're looking at until you yourself know God. That seems to be true of the human mind. In terms of human consciousness, I don't see why it wouldn't apply to spirit consciousness and ultimately to God consciousness. Of course, service enhances that. Marvin, one last thought. Where I wrote it? So yes, I think Marvin is correct. There is a circular flow from all this. It becomes a circular flow, but it tends not to start out like that. I really do think Jesus said that with the new commandment. You are my friends. You're not my servants, even though you call me master. But to remain my friends, you must love as the Father and I love you. That at least implies, if not presupposes, that you know the Father through Jesus, through Michael. And first, you really do come to those terms. And I see that in people's lives again and again and again. Those who know God have a living faith, and it's manifested accordingly. Many aspects have been covered. Those are some of my responses to some of my viewpoints on what has been touched on.
Thank you, Charles. A very rich set of observations. I will now turn to Marvin as the next speaker, and will comment to him that in the previous round of discussions, he was the bookend, beginning and the end of the discussion, and now he has the pleasure of following Charles. And whether he considers that an advantage or a handicap, I will not press it to answer. But in any case, Marvin, it's up to you.
I'm going to pick up actually a theme from what Steve said, and I'm in agreement with what Steve said. Because these passages that you shared with us, Neil, to me, what they're alluding to is the best summing term for me is idolatry. You know, they're the worst of institutionalized religion, creedalized or dogmatized religion, which Jesus contrasted what he was trying to promote as a living experience, is a form of idolatry. It puts something in the place of the higher reality that you're trying to deal with and worships it or prioritizes it. And I think if I'm looking at, let's say, Judaism and Christianity and the Urantia book, which is interesting to think about, and we ask ourselves, how would we describe the idolatry that characterized the institutional development of those three phenomena, one of which is unfolding as we speak, all of which are unfolding as we speak, but certainly the Urantia book is new enough, and we're all part of that process, which is part of the evolutionary process, the human evolutionary cultural process that flows out of a revelatory stimulus, right? With the Jews, it was a Melchizedek, the Jewish religion, the Hebrew religion. With Christianity, it was Jesus as the revelatory stimulus. With us, it's a book, a 2,000-page book, the Urantia Revelation. That's the revelation, right? What follows in its wake, what ripples out culturally, is the evolutionary human movement to cultural forms, the practices, the priorities, the activities that flow from that stimulus. So if I look at the idolatry that characterized Judaism, it was the idolatry of the priesthood. The religion, it became the religion about this priesthood, their history. It became the religion about the special status of the Jewish people in its worst senses. I mean, obviously there were good things about it as well. If you look at Christianity, the central idolatry, what it became the about rather than the of, right? It became the religion about the person of Christ and his resurrection. And what you had to do was to believe that Jesus was who he said he was Lord, he was Savior, and in his resurrection, and you were done. That's the idolatry. That's the superficialization of the religion. And I think we're actually, it's probably not very popular to say, I think we're quite a ways along in a parallel idolatry with this revelation as well. I think what is easy and natural, which is where these cult phenomena occur, automatic, easy, natural, unconscious, it's easy and natural for this movement to have become, and it is becoming substantially, a religion about the Urantia book as a phenomenon. We're enamored of it. We're impressed with its revelatory nature. We get excited about it. We talk about it. We read it. We study it. We discuss it. That's a form of idolatry, in my view. If you talk about the religion of the Urantia book, it's the same as the religion of Jesus. What Jesus was talking about, and what the Urantia book really speaks about, is a living relational reality. It's a set of unfolding living relationships that unfold through time. So it's the relationship we have with God, the living dynamic experience of being in communion and relationship and loving and being inspired. And it's the relationships we have with each other, with all people around us. You can't capture that or codify that. It's an unfolding moment-to-moment reality. And it's easy for us to fall into, with the Urantia revelation, the equivalent error, of dogmatizing and traditionalizing our revelatory stimulus, getting excited about its nature, rather than really rising to the challenge of trying to live out the spiritual truths that it's calling to us to live out. That's a lot harder. It's a lot more challenging.
Marvin, you have said many things that really are very profound. I would focus on just one aspect, the tendency of readers of the Urantia book to use the word Urantians to mean readers of the Urantia book. Well, if only we who read the Urantia book are Urantians, what about the other 6.5 billion people who live on our planet? Are they aliens? Aren't they entitled to be called Urantians also? If you go through the entire 2,097 pages, every time that the revelators use the word Urantians, they refer to the entire population of our planet, not to people who are spiritually or intellectually interested in a particular set of principles or teachings. So we indeed have to be conscious, in my own opinion, of the spiritual reality that you have portrayed. Bob, I would turn to you now for whatever purposes you may wish to explore.
Coming off of what Steve said, again, I agree with the general theme of what Steve said and Marvin supported, and Charles clipped around the edges there. And the first thing I thought about after listening to all three was, okay, Jesus came into a situation of his bestowal and brought with him, of course, a huge gap. Once he finally realized his divinity, he still humanly studied all these, all of the prophets and the ideals and ideas that he called out as he was starting to reach understanding of his divinity. So what was the gap between where Jesus finally wound up and what the first century culture had? And what's the gap between where the Urantia papers have delivered these concepts, advanced type concepts of cosmic consciousness and spiritual import, and what's the gap there? Is it the same? I think it's greater right now, actually. And the methodology Jesus took was to after he systematically studied these, higher and higher ideas, he didn't route around and purge out the lower ideas. What he did in each case was to select the truth in what was taught and then proceed to embellish and illuminate the truth in their minds at a very short time. This enhancement of truth effectively crowded out the associated error. I think Andre Rodatis, in our practice session when we were discussing some of this, said last time that the larger brings with it the lesser, and the lesser can diminish the larger in many cases. So I think what Jesus did is the first part, bring along the larger, bring along the lesser as you're bringing into the larger. And I think a methodology is important here. And going back to what I think what I had heard from what Steve started with this theme is that there's this huge gap. There's this fifth epochal revelation with all that it has, and the gap between where 20th or 21st century society is, and it's a hybrid society. We've got philosophies in the East more than we do have religions. Going to be a very interesting thing, but I think that the methodology is the most important to be able to take this next millennium and potentially 2 millenniums, as did the fourth epochal revelation, to get it to a point to where maybe the next teacher's son could come to be able to do some foundational teaching based on where that time has taken it. So interesting conversation, and more to come for sure on that one. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. As the chances of this discussion have worked out, Doreen, you're going to be next, since all the others have spoken before you. I would say that this phenomenon connects reasonably well with a common conviction among many men that a woman always wants to have the last word. But in this case, you do have the last word. Here we are.
Okay. Well, you can't lead people to God unless they're hungry, you know, and they want to receive, I guess, some light or enlightenment for their soul. It just doesn't happen. And how do you prepare, how do you prepare that? Maybe people have to, I guess, go through more trials and tribulations in order to seek out what it is they're missing in their life. And I can only say that for some reason, I'm just the luckiest person in the world, because I went to my attorney the other day and I haven't seen him in 18 years. And I walked in and he said to me, "There's something different about you." He says, "No, there is something unusual." And I don't say this to most people early in the morning. It was really early. And we started talking. And an hour and a half, we talked about the Urantia teachings. And he studies, I think, Richard Rohr. And I think his name is Richard Rohr or something like that. Anyway, it was the most wonderful discussion. I spent maybe a half hour on what I really came there to do. So there are so many people that are hungry and they're really interested to find and discover there's things missing in people's lives. And what he said to me, he says, I'll go back. I used to love how Jesus talked. One thing that really attracted me was he never tried to destroy anything. He always put the attention on the good. He presented virtues instead of attacking the vices. He replaced evil with all the, the goodness. And he changed the focus, your mind, from faults and failures to forgiving, which nullifies revenge. And that's what I remembered. So now, he said to me, I used to tell my wife what to do. I always said, well, do this and do that. And he says, and one day, and I thought to myself, why should I tell her what to do? She's her own person. And he said, and I stopped. And then all of a sudden, the following week, she did everything I asked. It was, this idea of who's going to infringe on someone else? Where is the respect and the dignity for each other? How is it that we look at each other with such differences that we don't look at them with the eyes of God? How does God see us? How does he appreciate us? How does he allow us to make our mistakes and then make other decisions and correct those mistakes? So I find that in all my travels and in the parliament that we went, there were so many people doing the work of God everywhere, and just differently, in different ways, and whatever attributes they have, they're out there seeking and they're sharing their lives with others. So, when you read all this stuff and what it demands, I can't force anybody to be something they're not. I can't put into their minds, because I'm an authority, I have a book. No, I never mentioned the book until they asked me. And of course, they always ask me at the end of the conversation. But it's really being real and no facade and no, this imposition and authority and intellectuality. I'm just a simple person. I talk simply. And when they know they're not threatened, they're really open and receptive to a lot of the teachings that we have already learned. So when you read all this, and I'm not going to give all the hyperbole because it's already been said, many of the stuff, but I know in my heart that those guys up there, those spirits, they are working so diligently. I think there's not a day where I don't have an opportunity to enrich somebody's life, and they may. And it works both ways, because then you realize what you're made out of and how God works in your personality and the individual, how they respond to it. So it's a give and take. And you're right, eventually, and I'm always, I know Jesus said patience, patience. I just have to bide my time. I cannot force anything. I cannot rush anything. Growth it's individual, and the Spirit is leading us, controlling us, or adjusting us at one point or another. And I trust that it is, and I see it operating. So, with all things said, I don't know, the goodness of God and the power of love, I know, overcomes the love of power. That's how I see it. And if we all go out there and share that part of our soul consciousness, that love, I think the world will be little by little, in 1,000 years perhaps, but it will be transformed.
Thank you, Doreen, and your focus on the potential for responsiveness of individuals is welcome, and I would say very interesting. There was one part of your wording that I have a little bit of an issue with. Charles called attention to the fact that there was a systematic discrimination against women that grew up in Christianity. And we can all regret that. I think one of the great advances in the teachings of the Urantia book is to overcome that discrimination and to emphasize the equality of men and women. And so in that context, I'm a little bit troubled by your idea of those guys, those spirits, because the authors of the Urantia book have emphasized that angels are referred to by using feminine pronouns.
Right. She. Well, both, I think.
Yes, and furthermore, we have the creative mother spirit, who is the immediate partner of Michael Nebadon, yes, and the author of the adjutant mind spirits that minister to us. And the creative mother spirit, by virtue of the word mother, is female, at least from our perspective, although our categories of male and female are probably irrelevant to the spiritual realities. But they're our only way of understanding persons. We don't have an intelligent person who is androgynous. That has not yet been invented, although I suppose...
I think there are.
Well... The creators of artificial intelligence may be aspiring to achieve this, but I think they're not really going to be able to create persons as we understand it. In any case, I would now like to move on to the material at the top of page 89 in the document Revelation Revealed. In effect, this context has to do with the nature of the religion of Jesus as compared with the various religions of tradition. He was reacting in contrast to the teachings of Judaism at the time, or if you prefer, of the Hebrew religion. And he's made some very sharp comments. In the middle of that comment that appears within the box, there is the statement, is not a religion in the present day meaning of the word. And that statement, in turn, is highlighted in question 59 beneath it. Bob discovered in preparing that I had mistakenly credited that with the wrong location in the Urantia book. This is not from paper 103 by Melchizedek. It is from this same quotation immediately above by the Midway Commission in paper 155. So, Charles, I wonder if you would do us the honor of reading the lead-in paragraph at the top of page 89, followed by the quotation. I would then like you to stop there because I propose to read the question myself after you have finished. So could you please do that reading for us?
You bet. During the first discourse on true religion, Jesus told the apostles and evangelists that the religion that he and they would soon proclaim in Palestine contrasted very substantially with the religion of authority that the religious leaders in Jerusalem maintained and promoted. The new religion, he said, quote, shall derive its authority from the fruits of its acceptance that will so certainly appear in the personal experience of all who really and truly become believers, close quote, the Midway Commission. And Jesus went on to say, quote, at Jerusalem, the religious leaders have formulated the various doctrines of their traditional teachers and prophets, and the prophets, of other days into an established system of intellectual beliefs, a religion of authority. The appeal of all such religions is largely to the mind. Now we are about to enter upon a deadly conflict with such a religion, since we will so shortly begin the bold proclamation of a new religion, a religion which is not a religion in the present day meaning of the word, a religion that makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man, a religion which shall derive its authority from the fruits of its acceptance. That will so certainly appear in the personal experience of all who really and truly become believers in the truths of this higher spiritual communion. Close quote. Again, the Midway Commission.
Thank you. I would say that this paragraph, quoting Jesus for the most part, almost entirely, is a close paraphrase of many of the ideas that we have already discussed. The idea that the religion of Jesus involves personal experience and not the principle of authority or doctrine or dogma. So the issue I'm going to put to you when we address the question beneath has to do with where the understanding of humanity is in regard to this idea, religion. So let me read question 59. What did Jesus mean by declaring that his religion, quote, is not a religion in the present day meaning of the word, unquote? Although approximately 2,000 years have elapsed since he made that statement, would you be inclined to repeat it now? If so, why? If not, why not? Bob, I'm calling on you now. You have a chance at this question.
Thanks, Neil. When I started thinking about this question, I had to take a look back and think, well, okay, what was the conditions in the present day Jesus time in the first century AD? And, to juxtapose that, are we very much different? What is the current religion in the present day meaning of the word, in the 20th and 21st century? So to go back to the first century, we had the Greeks and the Romans were essentially henotheistic. They had a pantheon of gods, mostly a philosophy, and we've been given, enough to know a little bit about that. Judaism was an outward legalistic religion, if I could, use that as just a meta thought here. So the first century was, I think, what we would consider today to be relatively evolutionarily primitive. And I think that probably the Alpheus twins sort of epitomize that. The breakdown of who they were and how they fit in was pretty interesting. They fit into the common person. When you read a little bit about the Alpheus twins, you almost get the notion that they were mentally challenged, but I don't think so now. After taking a look at this, it almost seems like they were less thinking than humanity is today, but they were commonplace. So putting that into perspective, we still have religions of authority. There is no question about that. I'm not sure that the Greeks and Romans had religions of authority. I could be, subsequent discussion could prove me to be wrong about that. So it was a hybrid time in the first century. Today, we certainly have mostly religions of authority. And I think that the next question that we're going to have is, what are are there any movements that are starting to show evidence that this whole authoritarian paradigm is going to change? So is it the same? So I guess that the question is, although approximately 2,000 years have passed, would you be inclined to repeat it now? I go back to my original, when we first discussed this, and the definitions of religion. I took the broad case of what that meant for Black Friday. But let me put the first two out there, because this is where some of the definitions are today. So, we kind of know our conditions. I didn't talk a lot about that, but the definitions are the first definition is the belief in and worship of superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods, one capitalized, one not. And then the quotation is ideas about the relationship between science and religion, which I don't really understand. And the second one is a particular system of faith and worship, as identified by the world's great religions. So pretty basic. And knowing that we're still under the paradigm of religions of authority, I would have to say that with a qualified yes, that the answer is yes, because even though conditions today are vastly different from where they were 2,000 years ago, we're still exhibiting, matter of fact, more so than others. We don't have much henotheism anymore, but we certainly do have religions of authority. So I think that based on the definitions, based on the conditions, I think I would have to say that we would have to repeat that word or that phrase again exactly the way, not in the same context of the way Jesus meant it. Over.
Thank you, Bob. You have emphasized the situation of authority that prevails in many organized religions. I would say that one of the principles that is implicit in that idea of a religion of authority is the group. There is a group consciousness or a group structure. And perhaps we could talk about the group structure relating to observances and beliefs, which may be in the form of doctrines, but not necessarily. The pagan religions, there's that word, of the Greek and Roman world were largely religions of observances, that you offer a certain kind of worship by burning incense or perhaps making an offering. And the religion of observances was also an extremely important part of the ancient Hebrew religion. This is the way you do the ceremony. And so from a group perspective, we have a question of observances and beliefs, whereas the religion of Jesus has to do with personal spiritual experience. And ultimately, the question in the document, question 59 in the middle of page 89, has to do with whether or not the religion of personal spiritual experience can be understood by human beings today to be a religion, or whether instead there is such a close association with observances and beliefs on the group level that the religion of personal spiritual experience to many people will not seem to be a religion at all. And that is how I would paraphrase this question. If I have confused the matter, Steve, please enlighten us.
Well, I don't think it's an either or of personal spiritual experience versus group religion. The book puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of cult and the function of cult and cultic practice and the use of symbolism in terms of promulgating religion. And that religion can include personal. In fact, it has to include personal spiritual experience along with group worship. So cult is a unifier of those two. So I don't accept your bifurcation here between the two. And I think one of the dogmas in current Urantia book, one of the doctrinal beliefs is that the only true religion is personalized. I would not call it personalized. I would call it individualized. There's a big difference between individual spiritual experience and personal group spiritual experience. Personal spiritual experience has to take place at least sometimes in the context of a cult or a group practice of worship. It is not personal when it's individual. It's only personal when it's in a group or in a cult. And that cult depends on cultic practices, including the use of symbolism and group worship. And I'm sure Marvin will follow up on that.
You have led right to him and, in fact, read my mind because I was intending to call on him next. And Marvin, it's yours.
I think Steve and I are somewhat kindred spirits. I think we tend to move in similar lines of thinking. I'm going to sort of say a little something that I think is kind of controversial, and I'm just going to look at. And I'm not going to really go where you thought I was going to go, Steve, with the whole idea of cult and culture. By the way, the book defines cult as a technique for cultural manifestation. That's the term that they use. It's simply a way of culturally embodying a set of ideals or values, generically speaking. But looking at the passage that you're highlighting here, Neil, I'm going to pick out a couple of things. And emphasize them. At Jerusalem, the religious leaders have formulated the various doctrines of their traditional teachers and prophets of other days into an established system of intellectual beliefs, a religion of authority. So that's an equivalent phrasing, right? What Jesus means by a religion of authority is a system of intellectual beliefs. And then he says the appeal of all such religions is largely to the mind. And then at the end of the section, he says he's talking about a religion, a new form religion that makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man. So the new religion is an interactive relational religion between us and the indwelling spirit and between us and each other. I don't think that it's so much a distinction between personal religion and organized or group religion, as much as the distinction he's making is one between an individual religion of simply thinking, mindal realities, versus a religion of relationship realities, living relational realities. So, and I'll take it sort of a step further in terms of kind of, maybe this is what's the controversy stuff. I take a look at what we've been discussing for the last hour plus. It's largely mindal reality. We've been discussing ideas. We've been sharing mindal thoughts, our thoughts about this and that and the other thing, which is largely the cult or the culture of the Urantia movement. We sit and we discuss, we talk about stuff in relation to the book and its intellectual meaning, and we parse the meanings and we discuss them, you know, to great length. That's the main thing we do in our culture. So, and I think what Jesus was talking about in contrast is if I say to all of us now, you know, let's take a moment and feel the presence of God inside of us and love that presence and feel the love of that presence. And just enjoy that relationship, feel it, revel in it. That to me is what Jesus was speaking about as living relationship religion. And when we love each other and interact with each other, we care about each other. That's a living relational reality. Yes, we use mindal realities. That's part of it. And what he was contrasting is a religion that is merely a mind phenomenon, not a real living relational phenomenon, which inherently involves love and the sharing of affection, the sharing of life experience. That to me, in contrast, is what he was pointing to, is sharing our lives with God and sharing God in our lives with each other. And that to me is live, living, personal religion versus merely intellectual consent, you know, and not much engagement beyond intellect and ideas. So.
Thank you. I understand your point. I would add to your interpretation of this first sentence in the quotation ascribed to Jesus that intellectual beliefs are religion of authority. between the lines, the implication is an insistence on conformity or an insistence on uniformity of belief or observance. And so that is, in my opinion, an implication of the principle of authority. But in any case, I think, Doreen, Marvin's comments in effect amount to a test for you whether you can manage to love or express love for Marvin. Let me see how you do with that.
Wait a minute. You want what?
Naturally, I was simplifying his remarks, and it's love for each of us, and love for all of us. That really is the test, not just in relation to him personally. Go ahead.
No, of course you cannot. You know, how does God observe all of us and see how primitive we are and barbaric and still love us? It is really a difficult thing to try to understand. So I try to look at people in the way not to look at what's wrong with them. I only try to look what's right. I don't find that demeaning another human being is what God would ever do. I don't find disparaging other people is the right thing to do anymore. I really don't sit in judgment. It's changing me, and it's becoming more apparent because of perhaps all the negativity that's going around, and it's that cancer that's spreading in society. And I want to see the benign virus of love. And when they talk about revolutionary love, and what did they say? Malignant revolutionary love. And they made a statement on the stage at the parliament like that. And I thought, how could those two words be in the same sentence? It's benign. It's love is such a beautiful expression from God that you cannot go around thinking that you're going to revolt people you're going to force in their face them to love. What are you going to do? Have a march on love? No, it's individuals by individuals. But anyway, I had jotted down some thoughts about this. And I found something which Alexis de Tocqueville said, and he said, the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom marching in different directions. And it is so true how what's happening today, where there was so much forced things, the Christian forced, I guess, baptism on the Jews and the Muslims. And then, people were just killed for the greater glory of God. I just don't get all this and how people interpret it in their minds at the time. And you can go on and on. The plundering, all the stuff that had taken place throughout the centuries is horrific. But the church made itself the kingdom of God, believing there is no salvation outside of the church. So they became the most important thing of people's lives. And this is, it was so fundamentalist that they were intolerant, self-righteous. And religious peace comes, where there is differences and accepting of differences and appreciation of differences. And I love, to engage in all these different ideologies with due respect for every person. I don't know why, I guess, institutions feel they have to be the authority on anything. What I asked some people today, because I said, how many people go to your church? And they said, not many, but you know what's happening? We love the dialogue now. We could break up and really have conversations. We could engage in the discovery of each other's differences. And it's nice. They said it's really nice. When there was too many people, they couldn't do that. But I think it's, the religions were given to us so many thousands of years ago, and they're deeply rooted, in a morality and a set of do's and don'ts at that time. Today, people are much more leery of that, of authority or anyone telling them what to do. But I wanted to follow up before what you said on the last question. When I was speaking to this Buddhist woman, and she said that she was the first one to break the glass ceiling. And she made a presentation on the podium. And she said, now there's thousands of women that are Buddhists. Before they would punish her and they would treat her so indignantly, she said they would go to meetings and all the male Buddhists, what would happen, they would get in free, but they made her pay for everything. She said, could you imagine the arrogance? So, but that was just last century. It's not that long ago. So things are changing gradually, and I think for the better. We can't rush it, but the more people you speak to, there are other things that are happening. They're reaching out in different ways. It's not tradition anymore. They're really just looking for spirituality, and they're not interested in the rules and regulations and the rituals and the dogma, and all that stuff doesn't have an appeal. And the younger people are questioning everything. They're really not swallowing anything hook, line, and sinker. But I think it's good, and it'll lead to something better, I believe. So that's why the revelation that we have is fabulous. It's fabulous because there is no authority in the Urantia movement. It's just study groups. And people ask me, well, who's in charge? No one. It's just differences of opinion. We listen to each other and we try to extrapolate the best of thinking, even though we're all coming from different backgrounds, different ideologies, some atheists like myself and others, and some religionists. But I don't know if this is the answer to the question you're asking. I kind of lost track in all the rhetoric, but I truly believe that this is the design. This is how the Spirit leads us. I'm not really worried and I'm not devastated. The world is coming to an end. I think that the overseers of the angels, of nations, of religions, they're all working in an effort to make this work. And I know, again, from personal experience, I see it working everywhere. I just do.
Dorian, thank you for your very interesting remarks. I would, in effect, take advantage of your remark where you admitted that you're not sure you were answering my question. So I'll go back to the question whether a religion, the religion of personal experience, the religion of individual perceptions along the lines that Marvin explained, can be accepted by human beings at large as being a religion, in that it does not involve doctrines, it does not involve authority, it does not involve observances that are required. Can that still be understood with all of these elements as being a religion in our day?
But of course, Neil, that's how I found it.
It's clear that you understand it that way. It's clear that I understand it that way. It's clear that all of us in this discussion understand it that way. But the question that I asked in the document, and in effect, in doing so, I quoted a statement by Jesus, is whether the world as a whole, society as a whole, understands those practices without authority, without doctrines, without required observances, as a religion.
But it's so personal. So therefore, when people are seeking, and I believe that they have in them the absolute divine being who's going to try their very best to lead them to whatever their needs are in their own time. Yes, I believe that it could happen and it will happen, because I know a lot of people that already have found it that way when you speak to them, just that they don't reveal it. It's a funny thing. People are reluctant to share their personal experiences. Sometimes they're embarrassed. But I just met a new reader that was hidden for years, and he moved 2 blocks away from me. And I took him to a study group a couple of weeks ago, and he said the same thing to me. And I was amazed, it's like, you really did. And others, we had so much in common that I couldn't believe it, because I don't have a problem speaking up after all these years, but other people do, and they're kind of introverted. But yes, I believe absolutely it's going to happen. This is the design. Why would God put in a part of himself to adjust us, control us, and lead us, or lead us and control us, if that wasn't the purpose that eventually and ultimately it's going to happen? So, yes.
Well, thank you, Doreen. I think now that I've heard your various interesting comments, you will have to yield to Charles, and I know it's perhaps disappointing to have to yield to Charles, especially since his image here is in the shape of a telephone. Anyway, Charles, it's up to you now.
I guess it makes me a communicator,
I suppose,
or something along those lines. May I be a great communicator someday. I think the potential, let me first say this, the potential for direct personal contact spiritually with God's divine spirit may be, it certainly is, one of the great contributions of the Rancher book. As individuals, we are personalities. Our individuality is defined and determined in reality by the bestowal of personality, unique, sovereign, absolute, changeless. So personal religion is an abiding and significant, profoundly monumental concept in the fifth epochal revelation. I agree largely with you, Neil, in your statement about many people have a tendency today to take religion, the religion of authority, in whatever form it is, and elevate this in their minds to the equivalent of religion, period. I've encountered this personally many times. When asked what my religion is, I'll say, well, I follow Jesus. These individuals immediately want to classify me or categorize me as Christian, automatically. I was raised Christian, but I left when I was 20 because I was spiritually hungry. And I've experienced this in a variety of settings, from hospital stays to workplaces and seemingly random conversations in, say, a restaurant. And I think there's a strong tendency because the contemporary meaning of religion, or at least practice of religion, I think more or less still retains its ecclesiastical authority at its core. Seems to me it does. Now, the nature of the Urantia book is a challenge never before presented on Urantia. And so I think it was you who said, readers and students of the book who consider themselves the Urantians are making the same error. Indeed, they are. It's an error I've never made. And in my writings and my talks, I've always reminded people that all human beings, all mortals born here, are Urantians. You could argue that Midway is the Urantians, and in a sense, by inheritance, perhaps even the angels, certainly the Midways, who originated here, both primary and secondary, and all mortals, by definition. Jesus is Urantian. Literally, he bestowed himself here. I'll make another point, another observation, and I'll elaborate. Just as you can swing too far to the intellect, you can swing too far to the spirit. Jesus never made such an error. The book postulates in a number of ways, both indirectly and directly, that is implied and explicit, his practice, the wisdom of balance, of balancing facts, meanings, and values. We have in this revelation, I've said before, I'm going to repeat it, a unique challenge on a planetary scale. We have to study, attempt to discern, to learn, and implement facts, meanings, and values, or science, philosophy, and religion. The issue is not just religion or religious consciousness or behavior. It involves scientific aspects, philosophical considerations, and religious considerations. That's the core of the first three papers in many respects, although of course the first five introduce the Father. And the fourth reflects this. Jesus studied before he went out with outreach, before he went public. he studied. He studied language, history, theology, philosophy, and people. And he got to know people by getting to know them, by interacting with them. He went out of his way to do that. And in other words, he grew largely through experience, but in doing that, he integrated facts, meanings, and values, as well as truth, beauty, and goodness. And I think as a movement, we've yet to really come to terms with that and do all three. We also have the perspective the Divine Counselor gave us of origin, history, and destiny. You must study, you must know them all to understand any phase of reality. All. These are enormous contributions, but we have to address all of it. That's why it's a 1,000+ year challenge. And I think Doreen is correct. It can take 1,000 years. It could take even longer. It might even take longer. It's not likely to take shorter. It'd be nice, but it's not likely, in my opinion. So we want to be careful. We don't want to have imbalance for a otherwise good objective. It is true in the early years, I even wrote an essay on this subject along with someone else, that we didn't pray very much as a group. Now, prayer has it has a wide latitude. There are all kinds of prayers and all kinds of motivations to pray in all kinds of forms. We know that prayer, in essence, it's the intent. It is the attitude of the soul that matters. And the form, not that it doesn't matter, but the form is not what really matters, really is significant. It's the attitude of the soul. But as a group, again, the last 55 years or so that I've worked with and observed, this is through experience, my own experience. I've observed that, in my opinion, as a movement, more and more people are slowly, gradually manifesting the habit of group prayer. I can't speak to individual prayer except for those individuals that I know and who have told me, and ditto for group worship. It's much greater now, manifested, say, at conferences. Study groups, we always have an opening prayer and a closing prayer that's extemporaneous, as people are moved. There is no planning for it. So I think, again, I would maintain maybe in 100 years we can make an assessment of this movement with regard to whether or not we will fall in the same pitfall that Christianity fell into. I don't mention other religions because the topical focus you have presented is on Christianity, and we're contrasting and comparing it to that, so I'll just limit it to Christianity. I think it remains to be seen to what extent we'll have dogma and not the religion of the Spirit. It remains to be seen. I think it's a work in progress. And I would say, as one example of the spirituality of the movement, is the role of women. In American history, starting in 1869, the farmers out west and back east formed the National Grange. And women had positions of authority because farmers have a labor-intensive life and they respect labor that produces. And women also labored hard and produced. You could see it directly in ways that culture valued. I have found this to be a large. What Doreen said, I don't think is in the least an exaggeration. I think the role of women, in terms of being, to a certain extent, authority figures, not authority over an organizational sense, talking about authority figures based on character, quality of intellect, and the power of soul, the power of their souls, is comparable to the men. And I don't see that historically in Christianity. Again, as I mentioned, and some other people mentioned, Doreen also mentioned, somebody else may have, there has been a softening of that. There has been an expanding of that in some Christian churches, in some sects. But the role of women, there were women in the Contact Commission. There were women in the Forum right away at the beginning. We have redefined authority thanks to the revelation. To the extent we will adhere and honor that, I guess, remains to be seen. I'll grant the other argument that but I think it's way too soon. It's only been about 60 years. That is not very long. It's about 3 generations, plus or minus. Maybe another 100 years. We can, as I said, we can discern whether or not how actual our behavior is vis-a-vis the teachings in all 4 parts. But we always remember, the Rancher book is not a religion. It's not just about religion in any sense, any historical sense. It's also about science and philosophy and history that ties it together. It is about personality, the relativity of facts, meanings, and values, and the relativity of matter, mind, and spirit, but the absoluteness of personality. I'm very hopeful for our movement based on some of the examples I've cited. Oh, by the way, Doreen, in the civil rights movement, we did have marches for love. They did happen. And we had gatherings in groups for love. Not only love, they had tactical purposes and strategic purposes, because it was a movement for change, but in a very broad, profound sense. But there were marches for love. King, this was done intentionally. When you prepared to be a protester in the civil rights movement, you were expected to go through training, spiritual training of nonviolence, and it started with forgiving. You forgave your enemy, your opponent, even before you met him or her, say in a restaurant or a beach or an amusement park or a theater or downtown in the main street. Those things did happen. They do happen. They can happen and did happen. Gandhi did the same thing. So I think we're evolving. We want to be careful not to, in circumscribing to a certain extent the intellectual life of this movement, to make the same error on the spirit side or the material. One last observation, Neil, if I may. I hope I have a couple of minutes more. We're not only dealing...
Charles, that Marvin is on a tight timeline, and I would hope you could wrap up.
I can, and I will. We're dealing with the revolt of secular materialism, in addition to the traditional religious mindset. And that is further complicated. Since the 18th century, as outlined mainly in paper 195, that's further complicated the whole matter of implementing the teachings of the Rancher book. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Marvin, you asked in a chat message to return to this question and supply an additional thought.
Yeah, I'll be brief, Neil. So the question you raise is, what did Jesus mean by declaring that his religion is, quote, is not a religion in the present day meaning of that word? And then Jesus says, a religion that makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man. If you take a look at how Jesus structured his endeavors, I don't think you would call it a new religion per se, but I think it's appropriate to call it a new religious movement that he attempted to begin. And I think we may, if we think productively and creatively, and I think in a way that reflects the guidance of this revelation, I think we could actually start a broad spiritual movement that focuses on living relationship with God and living spiritual relationship with each other and spiritual family, and make it a movement with certain cultural elements that provide continuity and organizational undergirding without a lot of the excessive dogma and structure that a typical religion would provide. So I think there's room sociologically between a full-blown religion and no structure in the area of religious movement in a looser sense. And with that, I'm afraid I've got to scoot. I've got some obligations I've got to get to, but I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Marvin. Let me give you a preview of what I intend to do in just another 2 minutes. We're pretty close to the 2-hour mark now. I am going to read the 2 paragraphs at the bottom of page 89 Unfortunately, the time will not really permit a discussion of these paragraphs, but I would like to introduce the thoughts and then I will conclude for the day. So right now, if you permit, or if the others permit it, in the absence that you have just declared you're obliged to undertake, I will understand. So at the bottom of page 89, we have a section that heads Christianity, how it evolved. And I read, although the context of our discussion does not and should not enable us to rival histories of Christianity whose detailed narrative and scholarly analysis extend for over 1,000 pages, we can examine certain highlights that will suffice for our purposes here. From an historical perspective, the fundamental reality that we must grasp and absorb is that, quote, Christianity is an extemporized religion, as stated by the Midwear Commission in paper 195, specifically in section 10, paragraph 18, as the Midwear Commission points out. Lest there be any hesitations about what this means and implies, let me paraphrase this thought in ways that are colloquial and very clear. They made it up as they went along. Now, of course, we must explain that the word they refers to Christian leaders and theologians, and that the word it stands for Christianity. Given these minor clarifications, the sentence may seem shocking, at least to some persons who encounter it for the first time. Therefore, I believe it wise to intensify the reader's awareness by reiterating what I just said. They made it up as they went along. Yes, they definitely did. Now, I would go back to the word extemporized and perhaps do a little bit of a linguistic comment. Extemporized comes from the Latinate portion of the vocabulary in English. If you take it apart in Latin, it starts with the preposition ex, meaning from or out of in Latin, and tempore, meaning time. So extemporaneous or extemporized means arising from the time or coming out of the time. So the ideas in this very brief sentence are much clearer to most contemporary speakers of English. If we paraphrase it as I think I have tried to do, they made it up as they went along. And we are making it up too, as Marvin is promptly noting to us. So with that, I think what I am obliged to do, given the time circumstances that we are confronted with, is to say, we will talk about this as our opening point next week. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted that we had such an interesting discussion, and I look forward to it as a predictor of very interesting discussions to come.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
appreciate the opportunity, Neil.
Bob, you may close the meeting at your leisure.
Thank you, Neil. And we're closing the meeting right now. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, good night.